Welcome to another lecture in the series Perspectives on Economic Liberty, hosted by the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty here at Arizona State University, and co-sponsored this evening by the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. My name is Ross Emmett. I'm the director of the center, and I'm also a professor of political economy in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at Arizona State. The Perspectives lecture series emerges from the center's mission to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. One of the ways to fulfill that mission is to invite a variety of guests who will interrogate our center's topic by revisiting great debates of the past over the role of economic liberty, evaluate the economic liberty's contribution to human betterment for good or for ill, and to consider it in relation to other values and freedoms that we may hold. Our guest this afternoon is Dr. Doug Irwin. Doug is the John French Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College. His credentials for speaking on any topic related to the history of American trade policy are prodigious. His recent book, Clashing Over Commerce, 700 pages? Yeah, 700 pages. A History of U.S. Trade Policy was selected as one of the best books of 2017 by both The Economist and Foreign Affairs. He is also the author of Free Trade Under Fire, published in 2015, Trade Policy Disaster, Lessons from the 1940s, 2012 publication, Peddling Protectionism, Smoot-Hawley and the Great Depression. I have a particular affection for that book and for its topic because I lived in Canada and Canadians have a strong dislike of Smoot-Hawley. And if you don't know what we're talking about, that's inside baseball for Doug and I. And then also an early classic, which I used in classes actually, Against the Tide, An Intellectual History of Free Trade. Doug is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Not only is Doug an economic historian of free trade policies and regimes, but he is also a historian of the theories about trade, from mercantilism to protectionism, from import substitution, his topic earlier today at an economics seminar, to free trade. Doug's talk today is especially important as free trade faces challenges from almost all directions. A new trade agreement with our North American partners, a changing trade relationship with China, changes in the European Union, and debate within our own borders about the benefits and costs of trade. The context in which we're talking about trade has changed substantially over the past few years, and almost no topic could be of more contemporary relevance to us. Help me welcome Doug Irwin to Arizona State University.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and escape the New Hampshire winter for a little sun and warmth. I have to thank President Trump for making trade a top issue in the United States because that's been my specialty. I've been toiling away in libraries in relative obscurity for many years, but having trade in the headlines and something that's debated in the United States, well, it's very rewarding in some sense, discouraging in some sense, but rewarding in another because it's raised issues that I've been interested in for many years to the public fore. I'd be very happy to answer questions that you might have about the current trade situation. As Ross mentioned, I did just recently finish a whole book on the history of U.S. trade policy, going right back from the founding fathers right up to a little bit of President Trump. But I don't want to talk about current developments so much today. What I'd rather talk about is how do economists and philosophers more generally argue about the issue of trade? How do they think about it? What perspectives have been brought forth in the debate about whether free trade is a good idea or not? So I'm going to step back from sort of the current day-to-day bickering about trade policy and think about how have various groups made the case for trade over time. And basically, there are four cases, I think, that have been made for the last 200 or 300 years about why free trade is a good idea for any particular country. The first is a theoretical case. This is a case that came from economists, and it's making the argument that economic output in a country, real national income, real GDP if you will be higher for a country that's engaged in trade than one that will not be. There are gains from trade. And there's various theories, a particular theory in particular, that sort of would lead one to this conclusion. The second argument in favor of free trade is a moral case, saying that we as citizens have a right to trade with other countries. Any interference in that is depriving us of our rights. And I put up there the Age of Atonement. I'll talk about that when I get to that particular case. The third case is a political case. It's saying, well, there may be economic benefits, maybe there's costs and benefits about to trade, but really it's important for us for foreign policy reasons, for national security reasons, to have open commerce between countries. That will lead to world peace, better diplomatic relations, and so setting aside the economics, there's a politics case for trade. Then the last one is an empirical case to buttress, in some sense, the first one. The first case was a theoretical one. In principle, things might work out the best under trade. The empirical case is, well, does it actually? What evidence do we have that countries benefit themselves from pursuing a policy of free trade? That actually has come very late in the day in terms of all these cases that have been made over many, many decades, if not centuries. So let's start with the first one, which is the theoretical case. And Ross mentioned a book that I've written that I'll show you in a moment called Against the Tide, an intellectual history of free trade, where you can go back to the Greeks and the Romans. And Aristotle and Plato talked about trade. And the scholastics taught about trade in the medieval period. And they had their views both pro and con on trade. But really, in terms of the economics, the starting place is Adam Smith, who in his two-volume work, The Wealth of Nations, a great read, a great book, in book 4 makes a very powerful case for free trade. And first of all, I guess I should say a little bit about what do we mean by free trade. What we mean by free trade is no government impediments to exporting from a country or importing. So strictly speaking, it would mean zero tariffs, zero quotas, zero restrictions on international trade. It's not in favor of trade in the sense that you're discriminating against domestic commerce for trade, but saying you want neutral incentives between the decision of private firms and consumers whether they buy from at home or producers abroad. So it's sort of that neutrality proposition. Now, as a practical matter, of course, very few countries pursue a pure policy of free trade. You might think of Singapore or Hong Kong in the past, but most nations have some barriers to trade. But we're talking at an intellectual level here. Is there a case for reducing trade restrictions and moving towards free trade or not? Adam Smith made, there's two components to Adam Smith's argument. He made a powerful case for free trade based on what he called the division of labor, and implicitly that countries would specialize in goods that could be best produced in one particular country and then exchanged. And he thought that world output, therefore world consumption, would be higher with free trade and that specialization as opposed to countries pursuing a policy of autarky, no trade, or restricting themselves just to themselves. He also, I think, made an even more powerful argument against restricting imports. Now, those are two sides of the same coin in some sense, but sometimes it's hard to show the actual benefit that you'll get from pursuing a policy of free trade. It's easier in some sense to show the costs of restricting imports, because then you see exactly what happens to prices, you see how consumer choice gets restricted, and you can see who's going to pay a higher price. And in book 4 of The Wealth of Nations, I think he made a very powerful case for why restricting imports would not be economically beneficial, maybe even better than his case for a positive case for free trade. But when he made his arguments, they're largely on grounds of economic efficiency. That's what The Wealth of Nations is about, economics. And he's not talking about other criteria for evaluating trade policies. And there may be many criteria. In fact, he famously said that defense is more important than opulence. Now, what does he mean by that? The first duty of a sovereign is to protect the citizenry from foreign countries if there's a threat. And defense being more important than opulence means that you might want to sacrifice some economic efficiency, some share of GDP to protect yourself from foreign enemies. So he was not in favor of free trade in all, under every conceivable situation. He did make concessions at certain points to where it would not be advisable to pursue a policy of free trade, and the exception that he pointed out in the Wealth of Nations was the acts of navigation, the navigation laws, which sort of supported the British shipping industry. He said those are really defense-oriented. So one can think of exceptions like that. Now, of course, Adam Smith was a literary economist. He wasn't writing down a mathematical model or dealing with equations. That was left to David Ricardo, who is pictured right here, another British economist who wrote the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation in 1817. And there, just as there's a famous book 4 in the Wealth of Nations, there's this famous chapter 7, and that's actually mislabeled there in in Ricardo's Principles. I think it was the second edition. The chapter title was relabeled on foreign trade. And while what he did is he came up with the idea of comparative advantage. I put up the date there because it was just a little over 200 years ago that his book was published, and a bunch of economists celebrated the fact that this idea of comparative advantage was now 200 years old, and there were little parties held out with cupcakes and things like that to celebrate this idea, because it's a very deep insight. If you've taken maybe even Economics 1 or a class in international trade, I'm sure you've been taught the theory of comparative advantage. He used a little numerical example to show exactly how two countries with different production technologies could benefit by specializing according to what he called not absolute advantage, but comparative advantage. I don't want to give you a deep economics lecture here, but his point was that a country could be either technologically superior to all other countries or technologically inferior. There could be a big difference in productivity between countries, and yet both countries could still gain from trade. In other words, here's the unintuitive example that comes from this. It might pay a country to import a good that it can produce more efficiently than another country. And likewise, it might be more efficient for a country to export a good that it cannot produce as efficiently as the other country. So in other words, if you're a very poor, underdeveloped country, you could still gain from trade, even though you don't have the best technology. And even if you're the richest, most productive country in the world, say the United States, where you can produce everything better than everyone else, you still gain by importing goods that you could produce more efficiently. So the simple example that economists might use in the classroom is take the very best athlete. So who's the best basketball player today? LeBron James, Steph Curry. We can debate this proposition. You can't put this person at every position. You wouldn't want a team just of them. You want to put them at point guard or forward, wherever their comparative advantage is the best, even though they may have an absolute advantage in playing any position aside from anyone else on the team. Now actually, the idea of comparative advantage sometimes is a justification for economists not to do work around the house and to hire someone else. So I might be able to mow my lawn more efficiently than the neighborhood teenager, but I can sit on my duff, watch TV, and justify to my wife doing so is on the basis of comparative advantage, because even though I could do it better, it's more efficient for me to specialize and do something else and hire someone who's going to be very inefficient to mow my lawn as opposed to myself. But the idea of comparative advantage is a very deep insight. It's sort of central to a lot of economics, and it powerfully makes the case that economic output and therefore well-being will be higher in the case of trade as opposed to no trade. Now, economists have dealt with all sorts of theories about trade ever since David Ricardo. We've had 200 years to work out various examples and counterexamples. The one problem with theory, however, is that it usually has to be based on certain assumptions. And there's a very famous Australian economist, Max Cordell here, who says, I think something that all economists would subscribe to, is that theory does not say, as he says here, as the ill-informed or the wrongly taught would suggest, that free trade is best. It says, given certain assumptions, it is best. And so you have to appreciate what are those assumptions, and are those assumptions appropriate in any given case? And let's say we deviate from those assumptions, and we change some of the configurations that we're taking under our consideration. Does that compromise the case for free trade? In fact, the story of economics ever since David Ricardo, which sort of firmly established as a general principle that trade is good, has been to look for, what are weaknesses in that case? What assumptions can we change to show that trade is not so good? And then maybe government intervention would make us better off as opposed to free trade. And that's why John Stuart Mill, the great British philosopher in 1848, said, defeated as a general theory, the protectionist doctrine finds support in particular cases. And that's what economists have sort of played out in terms of theory. Is there a case for protecting infant industries? Is there a case for protecting certain workers in certain sectors if there's a labor market distortion? Is there a case for protecting certain industries or restricting trade if a country has monopoly power in world markets? So in other words, change the assumptions a little bit, maybe you'll change the implications for trade policy. That's what economists have been working on. And in fact, it wasn't so long ago. This is an article by Paul Krugman, who's now more famous perhaps as being the New York Times columnist, but he won the Nobel Prize in 2008, I believe, for his work in international trade. When he was at MIT, he wrote this article in one of the leading journals in economics, the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which is designed for a broader audience, saying, is free trade passé? Maybe free trade's not all it's meant to be. And what he says here is that the case for free trade is currently more in doubt than at any time since the publication of Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy, not because of political pressures, rather it's because changes that have recently taken place in the theory of international trade itself. And that is because in the 1980s, when he was writing, economists were playing with a different sort of analytical framework where you're changing the assumptions about the degree of competition that led to the conclusion that under certain circumstances, under certain assumptions, government export subsidies or possibly import protection might be welfare improving under certain circumstances. Now, it turns out, not too long after this was written, in 1987, that there's a lot of criticism or critiques of those theories, and it was pointed out that they're rather fragile in terms of their underlying economic underpinnings, and so no one quite as they were in 1987 would believe Krugman that free trade, the idea of free trade is that fragile a proposition, but at the time it created quite a stir among economists and among policymakers and made a bit of a splash. Well, that's where I sort of ended my book on the intellectual history of free trade as sort of the last theoretical challenge to the idea that free trade is the best idea out there. But the book goes back and talks about many of these debates. And if you looked at sort of economic opinion, if you were to survey economists, do you think free trade is a good idea or not? You know, it goes up and down and waxes and wanes depending on the theories that are being proposed and the ideas that are out there. I guess I'd conclude on this segment by just saying that theory is sort of somewhat fragile as a way of arguing in favor of free trade, because one could always say, well, the theory doesn't apply in this case, or the assumptions you're making don't work out in the real world. So while it has been compelling for economists over many, many decades, in terms of persuading the public, pointing out the theory of comparative advantage may not work. In fact, George Stigler, the great University of Chicago economist and Nobel laureate, once said, if you actually read to someone Ricardo's dry resuscitation of the theory of comparative advantage, what they would reach for, the conclusion that they would reach is not that they should embrace the idea of free trade, but that they should embrace a bottle of Portuguese wine, which is one of the examples that Ricardo had used in his particular example. In other words, you drive someone to drink rather than to try to figure out the nuances of that theory. So the second argument that is sometimes made in favor of free trade, not by economists usually, but by other, say, public intellectuals, is a moral case. So sometimes you'll hear from libertarians that businesses and consumers have a right to engage in free trade with other countries, and that if the government interferes with that, that's a violation of natural liberty. It's very interesting that Adam Smith used that idea of natural liberty as a sort of a philosophical underpinning for many of his doctrines, but he never invoked it in saying, well, that means the citizens have an absolute right and governments are wrong to interfere in trade. He was much more practical than that. In fact, most economists have been rather practical and not bought into the idea that people have a moral right to trade with other businesses or other countries, which is not to say that you can't hold that view, but they didn't sort of propose that in terms of talking about economic policy. So two economists on this, Jeremy Bentham, who you can actually see in the flesh. That's him. He is in the lobby of the University of London, the main hall there, because being such a practical utilitarian, he wanted himself preserved. And so he's in this glass case, and every time the Board of Overseers of the University of London meets, he is required to be at that meeting because he helped, through a bequest, found the University of London. Now, sometimes you can go there and these doors are closed, so you won't see him. But if you're there during business hours, usually Jeremy Bentham is out, and you can see him there unless he's being cleaned up and refurbished. At any rate, being a utilitarian, he says you judge policy not by some sort of natural right. In fact, he famously called natural rights as nonsense upon stilts. There's no such thing as natural rights. Who's giving you these rights? So he didn't like sort of John Locke and other natural right theorists. He was very practical. He said, utilitarianism is we care about the greatest good for the greatest number. And so if the greatest good with the greatest number comes as a result of restricting trade, that's what you want to do. None of this natural rights business. And he said, I leave it to Adam Smith and the champions of the rights of man to talk about invasions of natural liberty and to give a special argument. But he says, I have no horror with the hand of government. The government should intervene when they create the greatest good for the greatest number. And so he didn't write about trade policy directly, but if you are a utilitarian or were a utilitarian, then you take a very utilitarian view about whether free trade is a good idea or not. If it works and it benefits the greatest number, yes. If not, no. But there's nothing special or moral about that case. Well, John Stuart Mill, who was obviously another great, not just philosopher, but economist, wrote the Principles of Political Economy in 1848. He wrote a lot about trade, and he was a firm, staunch believer in free and open trade, although he also came up with certain exceptions. But in his book On Liberty, which I'm sure many of you have looked at, he said trade is a social act. So you don't have a private right to that. It's a social act. You're interchanging with others, and therefore the public has a right to regulate what you do as a social act. And so he said the so-called doctrine of free trade rests on grounds different, though equally solid, with the principle of liberty. He said restrictions on trade are indeed restrictions, and therefore we have a presumption against them. There's a presumption that restrictions will be not welfare improving. But he said that trade restrictions are wrong, not because they violate some natural right, but because they really do not produce the results which is desired to be produced by them. The principle of individual liberty is not involved in the doctrine of free trade. Okay, so he was in favor of free trade, but he said it's not a natural rights case. You don't have a moral right in some sense to trade with others. So some people may be willing to make that argument, that there's a moral case for free trade. Economists generally have not made that argument because they're much more sort of cost-benefit utilitarians in that way. Now, I did have up there the Age of Atonement. And that's because when you look at economic history and you look at why is it that Britain, around the time that Mill was writing, why did Britain begin to reduce its trade barriers? Particularly the Anti-Corn Law League was pushing for a repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. And in Gladstone's budget in the 1860s, they reduced tariffs to very, very low levels. Why did Britain in the early 19th century move towards freer trade? The argument the economists would like to make is that, well, we economists sort of instructed the public and policymakers about what the right policy was, and they were just following our dictates. Turns out economic historians have looked at it, have a little bit of a different view, and they said there was a religious revival in Britain in the first quarter of the 19th century, and it was religious leaders who were pointing out the benefits of trade and the rights to interchange with other civilizations and other countries, and that religious leaders actually made equally powerful, if not more powerful or persuasive case to policymakers at the time about the possible benefits of trade. So policymakers are taking their ideas from all sorts of different sources, and it could have been that this religious revival, at least Boyd Hilton, the famous historian at Cambridge University, has made that case. So that's sort of the moral or natural rights case. The next one is a political case. That the reason why we want freer trade, across countries is that that is a way for countries to cooperate with one another. And if they cooperate economically, they'll get to know each other better, they'll become economically interdependent, and therefore they'll raise the cost of war and make them more peaceful. Now this doctrine, this idea actually goes way back to the Greeks and the Romans, where it was held by some early philosophers, but the person it's most notably associated with is Baron de Montesquieu in his book, The Spirit of the Laws. And he famously put forward the proposition that the natural effect of commerce is to bring peace. That countries will cooperate economically, will therefore not fight with one another, and they become reciprocally dependent with one another, and reduce the chances of war. And this has been an appealing argument for many, many years. You might have heard the phrase, if goods don't cross borders, armies will. Why? Because it may not apply so much to our post-World War II era period, but if you go back to the 19th century and the 18th century, there are a lot of wars that were being fought, and a lot of the wars were about territory and control of resources. What's an alternative to taking over a neighboring country that has a lot of resources that you want? Buy them. Trade. You don't need to fight a country and take over their coal mines or their iron ore. You just buy them. And so that was the idea that Montesquieu had, that you can just buy things across borders. You don't have to invade or take other countries over. Now this is in 1848, so this is one of the high points of the Enlightenment. This is Enlightenment thinking, that countries and individuals can get along through commerce. But ironically or interestingly, neither David Hume nor Adam Smith fully bought that argument. Now here are the two great thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment. You might think that commerce is pacifying and good for political reasons, not just economic. And there's some recent work done by Maria Pagnelli and Reinhard Schumacher pointing out that Adam Smith and David Ricardo had a very nuanced view on this. And they thought that commerce would enrich a country, but by enriching the government as well, it might make them more interested in defense and possibly make them possibly more aggressive even, because they could float their public debt more easily, and therefore they wouldn't have to fear the debt consequences of war. So there's a nuance there that this case was not fully bought into by those philosophers. But many, many other philosophers have bought the case. And so Immanuel Kant in Perpetual Peace says one of the things that governments could do to try to establish a world system where war is less likely is to promote trade. The spirit of trade cannot coexist with war. And so he says the more commercial interaction there is and the more dependent you are on other markets, you're raising the costs of war, and therefore this is part of a perpetual peace. This actually had a lot of political resonance in Britain in the 19th century and in the United States in the 20th century. So when we think about Britain moving towards freer trade in the 19th century, I talked a little bit about the Corn Laws and Sir Robert Peel's repeal of the Corn Laws, which was one of the first big moves towards freer trade. The leader of the Anti-Corn Law League, Richard Cobden, sort of a public activist in favor of free trade, he made the economic case, he made the moral case, and he made the political case. He was using all arguments at his disposal, just throwing everything at the political system to try to convince people to get rid of import barriers. And he famously made the case, the political case, saying that it will unite the world in bonds of eternal peace. And famously in 1860, he was one of the negotiators of what became known as the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty between Britain and France. Now talk about two countries that had fought year after year, decade after decade, one another, Britain and France. And yet in 1860, they formed this trade agreement, and they hadn't fought since. They were united in these bonds of peace. One reason why Brexit is so interesting these days is that you have to think about, well, if the European Union is so controversial or has become this big bureaucracy that's sort of divorced from the interests of the individual states, well, why do we have the European Union? Why did we create, the United States help create the European Economic Community after World War II? Well, which two countries had fought three major wars in the previous 70 or 80 years. France and Germany, the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, World War II. What was the matter with World War III between them? Well, now we have nuclear weapons. We don't want a World War III. And so basically we told Britain and France after World War II, you have to get together and make sure that you are economically and politically integrated so that you don't fight yet another war. So Cobden's ideas and Montesquieu's ideas have really had a big impact in Europe. They've had a big impact in the United States as well. So how many of you have heard of Cordell Hull? About 5 people. More people should know about Cordell Hull. He was America's longest serving Secretary of State from 1933 to 1944. He's the Secretary of State who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1945. And if you look at his Nobel citation, why did he get the Nobel Prize for Peace? A, he created the United Nations to try to get all countries once again to cooperate. Debate about whether the UN has been a success or not. But B, he wanted to promote freer trade around the world for the cause of peace. He was not an economist. He bought into the economic arguments, but the main argument he made in favor of freer trade and the U.S. leading the world towards a world in which there's more trade and more commerce is that it would reduce the chances of war and abet the cause of peace. And this is a representative statement of his. I will never falter in my belief that enduring peace and welfare of nations are indissolubly connected with friendliness, fairness, and equality, and the maximum practicable degree of freedom in international trade. You might have called him a free trader, but he didn't have the goal of free trade, literally. He said, we have to start the process of gradually reducing trade barriers and getting countries to cooperate in doing so. And if they cooperate politically, if they cooperate economically, it'll lead to greater political cooperation. In the 1930s, this is a very hard thing to sustain because there was the rise of fascism. Obviously, World War II was coming, and it was a very unpopular notion, and it seemed to be completely out of step with the way the world was going. But he persevered. He was very dogged in his determination, and he served up until 1944. He had an influence on the late Roosevelt administration that translated into the Truman administration. And after World War II, President Truman and all leading policymakers in the United States embraced Cordell Hull's program. And in 1947, the U.S. led to the establishment of something called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is one of the first conferences of many countries to agree to try to reduce trade barriers after World War II, when they were at a very high level after Smoot-Hawley and all the things that had happened during the Great Depression. And President Truman gave a very famous address at Baylor University in which this is what he said. It was right before the first GATT meeting, GATT conference. At this time, the whole world is concentrating much of its thought and energy on attaining the objectives of peace and freedom. We just fought this devastating world war, this hugely costly world war. And now that we had nuclear weapons, we had to make darn sure that we did not fight another war. These objectives are bound up completely with the third objective, the reestablishment of world trade. In fact, the three, peace, freedom, and world trade, are inseparable. The grave lessons of the past have proved it. Because as a result of Smoot-Hawley and the rise of trade barriers in the 1930s, there was international economic disintegration, which made it easier for countries to fight with one another. Whether that's true or not, it's almost irrelevant, because that's what people believe to have been the case. That there were economic causes to the war, and we have to get rid of those economic causes. There's nothing, I think, that illustrates this mindset after World War II more than this cartoon by Herb Bloch, the famous cartoonist of the Washington Post. We're here at the bottom, we have trade freedom, which is holding up political cooperation, which is holding up world peace. And off on the side here, we have the tariff lobby, the industries and the labor groups that are lobbying for higher tariffs for protection against imports. And that is shooting peas at trade freedom. They don't want trade freedom. They want to protect their own little turf in terms of not facing foreign competition. But the idea here is if you interfere with trade freedom, if you disrupt trade freedom, and you make countries less prosperous and less less integrated, you could jeopardize political cooperation. And if you jeopardize political cooperation, you might jeopardize world peace. It's a very fragile setup. So once again, whether you believe this linkage or not, it doesn't really matter, but many people did believe it at the time. That was the mindset about why the United States wanted to lead the world in economic cooperation after World War II. So we established the World Bank, the IMF, and these international trade agreements known as the GATT, which now we know as the World Trade Organization. So there's been a whole process since World War II. So that's the political case, and I think it's still a very important one. If you look at why President Clinton and President Bush, George H.W. Bush, fought so hard for NAFTA in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they made a little bit of an economic case, but it was primarily a political case, primarily a foreign policy case, saying we have historically had very bad relationship with Mexico over time, yet if we really want to help their economy do well, so that not everyone wants to migrate to the United States, and so we are seen as as a partner to the Mexican government and Mexican people, we should try to integrate our economies more and open up our market to their goods as they want to open up their market to our goods. And we will benefit from that economic exchange, but the economic benefits are almost secondary to the political benefit of having a peaceful, prosperous country on our southern border, just as we have a peaceful, prosperous nation on our northern border. That was one of the major points on NAFTA. Another very important factor behind NAFTA, to digress just a little bit, is Colin Powell, General Colin Powell at the time, was very worried about whether Mexico at that time, which was going through a very difficult economic times, whether it might be a failed state. And he said, we do not want to see the Mexican economy go down because we might have to put the 1st Division down on the southern border to stop refugees coming from a failed state. What's going on in Venezuela today? It's a failed state, and Colombia is paying the price. And so General Colin Powell is making a national defense argument for trying to help out the Mexican economy, not at our expense, but through mutually beneficial exchange by NAFTA, so we don't have to put troops on the southern border. But lastly, I want to come to the empirical case. Now, notice the 3 cases I've done so far. In some sense, you might find them compelling, maybe not, but they're all sort of in the head, they're ideas. In theory, free trade might be best. Maybe or maybe not, we have a moral right to trade with other countries. For political purposes, there might be some political benefit to having free trade among countries. How can you measure that? How would you know? So what's happened in just the past 2 or 3 decades or so is that as a result of quantification, big data, personal computers that allow us to analyze data sets, we've tried to look at, well, do countries actually benefit economically as a result of trade? Can we quantify those benefits? How do we know what's happening to wages, what's happening to work, what's happening to GDP? Adam Smith, there was no GDP statistics. There was actually limited trade numbers back then. So you couldn't really quantify the benefits or the costs of trade. And so what we've had over the past 30 years is an increasing array of historical evidence, that is, country case studies and looking at actual countries' experiences. Do things seem better after they adopt lower tariffs or not? And then quantitative analysis, where we look at some countries that open up and some countries that don't, and do the ones that open up perform better than those that don't? Can we measure these things? Well, in terms of historical evidence, case studies, this goes back to the 1960s and 1970s. And at lunch today, I talked about this really famous path-breaking book by Ian Little and 2 co-authors. That's Ian Little right there, who was an Oxford economist. It's called Industry and Trade in Some Developing Countries. And remember I said that with Adam Smith, he made a case for free trade, but also a case against import restrictions? This was a book that looked at all the developing countries that had very high barriers to international trade. And while he didn't say free trade is going to be good, he said those trade barriers are very economically costly. He made the case against high trade barriers in developing countries. And it was the first time, remember, the US had opened up a little bit, Britain had been open as a result of GATT and other things. Developing countries did not. They remained relatively closed to trade. And this is one of the first books that really identifying and not quantifying, but pointing out the economic costs of those barriers. Two other very famous economists in the United States, Jagdish Bhagwati and Krueger, did a whole series in the 1970s looking at, well, what are developing country trade policies? And when those developing countries try to open up, are they destroyed by foreign competition and made worse off? Or are they able to flourish as a result of gaining access to the world market? And here are just two of their books, looking at the anatomy and consequences of exchange control regimes and liberalization attempts and consequences. They too found benefits, but once again, it wasn't really numerical, it was more, or quantitative, it was more qualitative. Productivity picked up, wage growth picked up, GDP seemed to do better in a very qualitative way. But one of the, not the first paper, because I'm gonna sort of have to give you a higher view of this, but one of the first papers that really tried to quantify, if you will, in a regression framework, whether countries are better off by opening up to trade or not, was another very famous paper by Jeffrey Sachs, who many of you may have heard of because famous economist now at Columbia has written on all sorts of issues, world poverty and what have you. A piece published in the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity in 1995 called Economic Reform and the Process of Globalization, that looked at countries that were opened up to trade, compared them to countries that didn't open up to trade, and lo and behold found those that opened up to trade had better economic performance, and seemed to establish this in a fairly robust way. Now, the problem with statistics, of course, is that it's sort of the same problem with theory. So with theory, you can say, your conclusions follow from your assumptions. I question your assumptions. And if you change the assumptions, maybe the conclusion will change. The problem with any data analysis is, you're parsing the data in a certain way, or you're analyzing it in a particular framework, and if you change the sample size, how you code certain variables, maybe the conclusions will change. And that's exactly what happened in the year 2000, 2001. A demolition job on all the previous studies, empirical studies on trade liberalization and economic growth by Danny Rodrik and Francesco Rodriguez. And they said, all these previous attempts, the econometric specification is misspecified. They're using a very poor measure for openness, because it's very hard to measure trade policy in one metric. The results are fragile. If we change a few things, the results fall apart. And they concluded in the year 2000, the relationship between trade policy and economic growth remains very much an open question and is far from having been settled on empirical grounds. That's pretty damning, because if you can make the case in theory, but if you don't have actual empirical evidence that trade will lead to better economic outcomes, you really can't be very strong or confident in your assertions about trade policy. Well, that was in the year 2000. And so what I would note is that since then, that's 20 years ago, which it seems like just yesterday to me. Oh, I should, I guess, note one other thing. Notice that I'm thanked twice there, because I guess I gave two sets of comments, and one's Doug Irwin, one's Douglas Irwin, but I commented on the paper in draft form. But a lot of work has been done since then that addresses many of the critiques, and more importantly, we have more examples. So this is based on the Sachs-Warner original data on timing of when countries decide to open up. And what you can see is in the 60s, very few countries decide to open up to trade, developing countries. In the 70s, not really many. One of these is Korea, one is Taiwan, one is Chile. But in the late 1980s, the world began to change. And between 1985 and 1995, I think economic historians a generation from now will look back at that period, 1985 to 1995, and say the world changed. That's when globalization really hit, because all these countries, not because they were forced by others, but for their own domestic political reasons, they decided we want to open up to international trade. And so what's happened with China? How much did China trade prior to the Deng Xiaoping in 1978? They were not on the world market. What about India? India was pretty isolated based on its own policies. Did anyone trade with Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh? Most countries are isolated, not because the world system was pushing them away, but they said, we don't want to trade. So they erected very high trade barriers, but a lot of these began to peel off. This is a great experiment. Now notice that Rodriguez paper was published right about here on studies whose data ended right about here. And so it wasn't able to follow through with a lot of these countries in terms of, there's some great experiments here. What happened? So what happened is countries reduced their tariffs pretty dramatically. So these are just World Bank data on average tariff rates in developing countries and developed. The lower one, that's the US, Western Europe, Japan, and others. Those tariffs were already pretty low because they had been reduced in previous trade negotiating rounds. The blue line for developing countries, they had tariffs of about 30 to 40% in the early 1980s. That's enough to deter a lot of trade. And yet those tariffs have come down, almost converged, not quite, with those in the developing countries, developed countries. Even more important than tariffs, once again, there's no one trade policy. There's tariffs, there's quotas, there's foreign exchange controls. It doesn't matter what the tariff is. If you want to import something, you need government permission to get the foreign exchange to buy the good. The tariff could be zero, but if you can't get access to foreign exchange, you can't buy those foreign goods. The dark line there is the number of countries, or the percent of countries with foreign exchange controls. And notice what happened in the mid-80s to the late 90s, it goes way down. Countries began to reduce the extent to which governments were controlling access to foreign exchange. You know, actually, even Britain, after World War II, even New Zealand, until the 1980s, had foreign exchange controls. If you were a citizen in New Zealand in the early 1980s and you wanted a subscription to the Economist magazine or a foreign publication, you had to apply to the government for permission to get the $20 or $30 or $40 to buy that, subscribe to that foreign publication. If that's the case for any individual with a foreign, just a newspaper or something, imagine if you want to import computers or something like that. A lot of paperwork, a lot of permission was required. The Fraser Institute does these sort of numerical estimates or indices, if you will, of freedom to trade internationally. And once again, you can see for developed countries, they're way up there at the top. But developing countries, once again, starting around 1985, these things begin to change, and this index of economic freedom to trade internationally begins to go up and doesn't quite converge, but moves up quite dramatically. So this period between 1985 and 95 is a revolution in world history in terms of globalization. And the result has been soaring world trade. This is going back all the way to the year 1500 to the extent we can measure it. And it's measuring trade as a share of GDP, world trade as a share of world output. And you can see during medieval times, you could trade with ships across continents, but it's very difficult to move goods between markets. There's this globalization in the 19th century that led to rising share of world trade in world income. And then what happens? It declines. That's the interwar period between World War I and World War II, when we had the Great Depression and countries such as the United States imposed the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Other countries restricted access to foreign exchange and things of that sort. Then we see a revival after World War II, but the last sort of spike up, that's as a result of China, India, and all these developing countries moving into the world market. The question is, what does the data show about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if we go back to Danny Roderick, very famous and illustrious professor at Harvard, he wrote a paper in 1992, just as this process is unfolding. And what does he say? The idea of moving towards freer trade, the general idea is not tremendously helpful for policy at this time, and that the direct efficiency consequences of trade liberalization are still uncertain and likely to be small. He was not exactly optimistic of this prospect of opening up the world economy. I think evidence, however, we've got a lot of evidence, a lot of new studies just in the past few years on what's happened as a result of this big wave of trade liberalization. We have obviously a larger sample of countries, and we have improved econometric methods for addressing these things. There are 3 papers here which only the economists may be interested in, but I'll just mention briefly some of the findings published in the Review of Economics and Statistics and elsewhere that generally, uniformly come up with a couple of conclusions that trade improves economic growth for those countries that engage in trade liberalization, improves investment for those countries that do that and reform their trade policies, and with that, a whole host of other things come with it, including lower poverty, more efficient industry, modernization, better health outcomes, and things of the like. So just looking at this Waxyard and Welch paper, which sort of redid the Sachs-Warner paper with the improvements suggested by the Rodriguez paper earlier on, and what you can see is, based on timing, boom, at year 0, if countries open up, growth prospects increase by about 1 percentage point, or 1.4 percentage points. It doesn't go on forever, but for at least 10, 15 years or so, that growth will be higher. What about investment? Whoops. Investment. Once again, as a share of GDP, it goes up. Why? Because you're only willing to invest in a market if you don't just sell into that market, but you could sell into the world market. Because you'll have much more, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, as Adam Smith would say. And so countries that open up now become part of a larger world market, and investment pours in. And that's good for growth as well. What about exports? Once again, looking at countries that time their liberalization. When you date the time of when they open up at year 0, what happens is exports, as a share of GDP, go up by 8 percentage points. So the countries will be exporting more, and it's not shown here, importing more as well. So there's more trade as a result of opening up to trade, and the benefits have been generally good. So the conclusion from this new empirical literature, which I've only just briefly touched on, is that now I think we can say we have quantitative evidence, and not just one study, because just like medicine, would you trust one study? You want repeated studies from different angles to make sure that that exercise is good for you, that lowering sugar intake is good for you, or something like that. You want different people doing different studies. Study after study has basically shown that, first of all, trade leads to a modest increase in growth, but it's heterogeneous across countries. It's not true that every single country that's opened up has done well, because there are a lot of other things that you can't control for. Could be a recession in the world economy, could be you have domestic political difficulties, a lot of things could interrupt that. So that's why economists always stress that trade is an opportunity, but not a guarantee. It's not a guarantee that if you open up, everything's going to be miraculously better, but it gives you the opportunity to make sure that make things better. Second of all, there have been a lot of studies on particular countries that reduce their tariffs on intermediate goods, components, capital goods, inputs to production, almost uniformly and across all these studies, that giving your domestic firms access to more and differentiated intermediate goods will lead to higher productivity growth. And of course, higher productivity growth, that's the only way in which you can become a high-wage economy, by making the labor force more productive. And so that's a uniform finding as well. So I think we have been through, at least in my lifetime, not some of the students here, but in my lifetime, the mid-80s to mid-90s, an economic revolution, and the world changed in a very fundamental way around 1990. And it's not just this trade revolution, it's what's happened in other things as well. Income convergence across countries. Prior to 1990, there was no systematic evidence that poor countries would grow faster than rich countries and lead to a more uniform distribution of income across countries. The poor countries were not catching up. They may be maintaining a constant gap. After 1990, there's increased evidence that poor countries are growing more rapidly than rich countries, and therefore improving their economic prospects. They're not falling behind, they're actually catching up, not just maintaining. Second of all, it used to be, And here I'll refer to work by Bill Easterly, formerly of the World Bank, currently at, actually where is he? I've forgotten off the top of my head. He's visiting Berkeley, but he's at NYU. He wrote some papers in the mid-1990s saying all these reforms that have taken place, surely they must have paid off in terms of better economic outcomes. He couldn't find much evidence of that. But notice those are papers done in the mid-90s with samples of data that end around 1990 or so, just as this process is unfolding. He recently just redid this paper, updating with more recent data. And guess what he finds? There is evidence that good economic policies pay off in terms of better economic outcomes. So here's just the example of the, don't want to get too technical, this is the beta on the income coefficient in these cross-country regressions, just showing that there is catch-up. That red line is indicating 1990, so developing countries are beginning to catch up. And here is Bill Easterly presenting this new paper called The Unacknowledged Triumph of Global Triumph of Market-Based Economic Reforms. And if you look at his slide on the right there, he says, so nihilism, the nihilism about growth and market-based policies, including my own, he says, went too far. We judged these things too early before all the evidence was in. And of course, what we've seen is a big reduction in world poverty. So this world poverty going back to 1820, it's the share of the world's population living in absolute poverty. And you can see during the Industrial Revolution that it did decline a little bit, but as late as 1950, still 72% of the world's population was living in absolute poverty. And went down since, but look at what's happened since 1990. Dramatic reduction in the share of the world population living in absolute poverty. That's driven largely by two very populous countries. What are they? India and China. When did China open up? 1978 under Deng Xiaoping. When did India open up? 1991 under Manmohan Singh as finance minister, which led to tremendous economic growth and higher income. And so what's happened is, I think this liberalization has helped change the contours of the world distribution of income. So this is some of the best data we have in terms of the world distribution of income. And if you look back to 1800, remember that previous slide? 3/4 of the world's population in absolute poverty. Everyone was poor. We were relatively rich in the United States. There is that distribution of income there, but there's one distribution of income for the world. Everyone was poor. As a result of the Industrial Revolution taking place in the West, developing countries didn't enjoy that revolution and fell behind. We had, by 1975, a bimodal distribution of world income, where we had North America, Western Europe, and a few other places, and then the poor everywhere else. And by 2015, look what's happened. A big move up away from poverty, away with fewer people at this poverty line, and India and China are largely driving that. So what do I take away from this? Well, there are various arguments one can make for trade. As I've said, you can make a moral case, a theory case, a political case. You could say just based on the root evidence of history and experience, there's a case for trade. Each has their different appeal. Each will be used at various points in time. But I do think that last case, the evidence one, is one that we really didn't have in the past. That Adam Smith didn't say, I know from past experience that free trade works out for the best, because there weren't a lot of experiences with that. He just said, mercantilism really doesn't work out. It's theoretical problems with it, and it doesn't sort of help out. So it was not one based on a lot of experience. Economists have been most attracted over time to theory. We love this idea of comparative advantage. We love teaching it. It makes sense, but it's theory. But now we can supplement that with actual evidence. We can say that countries that have opened up have performed better than countries that have not. Now, the evidence may help policymakers, but in the past, policymakers, first of all, they've been very tentative about trade because they're worried about the downsides. I've talked about gains from trade, but domestically, there are winners and losers. And policymakers are very sensitive to the losers, perhaps even more so than they are to the potential gains of the winners. But they do appreciate the foreign policy case. So usually it is the case, if a country is beginning to open up, that either one of two things is taking place. Either they're economic technocrats, economists as technocrats who are guiding policy saying, I think that this will work out best for the economy, or you have political leaders who say, for political reasons, for foreign policy reasons, we need to cooperate with other countries and open up to world markets. So why don't I conclude there? I'm very happy to take any questions you might have about any of this or what's going on in the world today. Thank you.
Well, can we get this on? Is it on? Whoa, yeah, it's really on. Okay, and, okay. Yeah, there's several people who want to ask questions, and I have two microphones, and I was supposed to have a second person helping me, but I'll give one person, okay, sure. I'll give someone a chance. So instead of asking questions myself, which sometimes I have a tendency to do, there's lots of people here in the audience who have some really good questions, I'm sure, to start us off with. So if you can identify yourself, we'll keep two microphones sort of on opposite sides of the room, and so let the person on your side of the room know that you'd like to ask a question, and we'll kind of go back and forth.
Question, in terms of our trade with China, how big a deal is it that we have an imbalance roughly around $500 billion? Is there any way that can be evened out easily over time, or is that a real tough push?
I think American policymakers ought not to be concerned at all with the bilateral trade deficit with China. What we should be concerned with, and what I think the Trump administration is concerned with, is cyber theft and unfair trade practices. Here's why we shouldn't, the trade deficit is a diversion. What phone do you have? AT&T. What is the actual phone? Do you have an iPhone or an Android? iPhone. If you turn over your iPhone, don't do it, what does it say on the back of it? Well, what it will say is designed in California, assembled in China. Does it say made in China? No. Is it made in China? Not really. Most of the components in your iPhone are from Taiwan, Germany, Korea, United States, in terms of the phone, the chip, the camera, the circuitry. It is a world product. It counts as an import from China in US trade statistics because it's coming from China. The unit cost of an iPhone is about, I think, $200 or $300. Of that $200 or $300, about less than $20 is Chinese content. It's not really a Chinese product. And yet we count that $200 towards China. So our trade deficit with China is misleadingly high, in part because they are the assembler for all sorts of electronic goods, but they don't really produce all the components in it. If you looked at trade on what's known as a value-added basis, our trade deficit with China shrinks considerably, and our trade deficit with Japan and Germany and Korea, where all those components are coming from, becomes that much larger. So I guess there are two issues. One is, should we be concerned about the bilateral trade deficit, or should we be concerned about the overall trade deficit of the United States? Here's why we shouldn't be concerned with our bilateral trade deficit with China, because first of all, it's misleading on those grounds. Think about it this way too. What is your trade balance with your grocery store? Does the grocery store buy anything from you? If you're like me, you have a massive trade deficit with your grocery store. Yet you shouldn't be concerned about that bilateral relationship. You should be concerned about, at the end of the month, are you earning enough income through the export of your labor to others that hire you to pay for all the imports, the goods that you buy from the grocery store or Amazon or what have you? So don't worry about the bilateral, worry about the overall. Now the US does have an overall trade deficit. There are things we can do about that if we really made that a national priority. But what's interesting is that it's sometimes hard to make the case that the trade deficit hurts us, because when the US economy does well, when we're growing rapidly, when the unemployment rate is coming down, our trade deficit tends to go up because we're buying a lot of goods from other countries. When we go into recession, when we had the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, guess what happened to our trade deficit? It shrunk dramatically. So we shouldn't want another financial crisis to get that trade deficit down. The trade deficit reflects the fact that other countries are sending their capital to the US. And we have to think about, do we want that capital or not? The way I sometimes explain to my classes, if I have some money here, oh, I do, I have a dollar bill. What happens with the US trade deficit? If I have this dollar and I want to buy goods from other countries, I give them this dollar. I now have a $1 trade deficit overall. Now the other countries have this. What can they do with this? Can they pay their workers with this? No, they pay their workers in the local currency. Can they use this as a medium of exchange in India or China? No. The only thing they can do with this, they can do two things with this. They can buy a US good, in which case we have balanced trade. That's not what's going on. Or they can say, I'm going to invest this dollar in the US stock market or US treasury bill market, or I'm just going to save it. And basically what is going on is for every dollar of import, so we're handing a dollar to other countries, 75 cents comes back to the US to buy US good, that's US export. 25 cents comes back to the US in terms of buying US treasury debt or saving and investing in the United States. So the money does come back to the United States, but just not in the form of buying our goods. They're buying our assets. And if we don't like that, tariffs won't stop that process. Tariffs will restrict both sides of the transaction. What we could do is balance the federal budget so we don't have higher interest rates that are attracting that foreign capital. Encourage more domestic savings so that we don't have to reap capital inflows. If you look at the countries that we have these trade deficits with, they are high savings, low consumption countries. We are a high consumption, low savings country. But we can get them to change their policy, or we can get us to change our own policy. But if we tell the Chinese consume more and save less, and tell the Germans save less and consume more, then we're just berating them for things that we could do in terms of increasing our own savings rate and decreasing our own consumption here. So there are things we could do about it. It's not necessarily a top priority, I would think.
We have a question over here.
Students.
So you had mentioned certain assumptions that we would have to make with specific theories. One thing that keeps popping up in my head is specifically with coup d'etats that happened, especially with Iran during the 1950s, where we had entered in the form with the idea that we would receive oil back and had put a president in. Would you consider that a form of neocolonialism? And does that kind of dissuade the idea of utilitarianism as well?
Sure. First of all, that's not really the economics of the situation. That's the politics, where the U.S. would intervene in Central America or something like that. Obviously not, that's foreign intervention. I'd ask, political science to decide whether that's a good thing or not, but certainly that's not, economically or politically desirable, unless, of course, it's humanitarian, which might be a separate category. But then defining the difference, it could be U.S. special interests that are driving that versus some altruistic sense of the U.S. intervening for the benefit of those citizens. So here, the big debate today would be on Venezuela, where it's absolutely clear that the regime does not care about its citizenry and has driven them out of its country and has impoverished them. And President Trump recently raised the issue of intervening in some way, and we've certainly recognized the opposition leader. Obviously, there's a question about how much do we want to intervene in those affairs or just stay out. And when you go back to look at President Clinton in the former Yugoslavia, big debate about whether we should intervene in the Serbian war or not. I leave that to foreign policy experts and you as citizens to decide.
Do you think there are any tariffs or trade restrictions that you would favor if you were a policy advisor, and why?
The only ones I could immediately think of are exactly the ones that Adam Smith suggested over 200 years ago. If there were certain either industries or materials that were important for the U.S. national defense, that dependence on other countries or markets could not be relied upon, I think there would be a case there for restricting trade in some way. But I think I wouldn't make that a blanket case. One would have to prove it with actual evidence. So here's where the distinction becomes important, because President Trump justified his tariffs on imported steel on national security grounds. But what's very interesting is that Secretary of Defense James Mattis wrote a letter as part of that process saying there is no national security case for protecting the steel industry, because we here in the United States can produce 75% of the steel we consume, and that share is not going down, and we have more than enough domestic steel capacity to make all the airplanes and the tanks that we need. And in fact, we import most of our steel from Canada and Japan and Germany and Korea, which are all military allies of the United States. And yet the president himself went ahead and said, I think there's a national security case here for protecting the steel industry. I think the steel industry like that. I don't think it was done for national defense purposes. But notice that's what economists call a non-economic argument. It's not saying this is going to make us richer or more prosperous, but it's saying it's important for national defense.
So my name is Jacek. I'm with Project Arizona. I come from Poland. But my question is somehow related to national defense and free trade. So when the so-called Western world leaders, civilized world leaders, observe sometimes ugly regimes in places like Russia, Saudi Arabia, or Venezuela, they often think we should do something about it. They may have good reasons. They think about people in danger. They may have also different reasons, like how to make business out of it. But that's a separate issue. Very often we hear that better than making a military intervention it is to influence through non-military ways, means, and that's good. But when it comes to these non-military ways, usually number one is let's put sanctions. And sounds interesting, but we should know that sanction is like heavy tariffs, or it's even worse than tariffs. It usually means you cannot trade. So it means often that the average people in the U.S., if this is between, for example, US and Russia, let's say, average people, business people who are engaged in business in America cannot trade with people, maybe not average, but involved in business in Russia, but whose customers are average people. So at the end, it will hit these poor people who are our main concern. So what do you think? If sanctions actually do not produce the best possible outcomes, and I don't talk about sanctions against some, apparatchiks. I talk about economic sanctions.
Yep.
Then what's the other option on the table if we don't want the wars, hot wars?
That's a great question. It's a perennial issue in American foreign policy and the policy of other countries. So let's make it concrete. Has the U.S. economic embargo against Cuba either brought about regime change in Cuba, or is it sort of fruitless? It's hurting them, hurting us, no benefit whatsoever. And here's where we get into it's a non-economic argument, because it's not saying that we're better off as a result of those sanctions. It's trying to achieve a particular political or economic objective. The same thing with sanctions against Iran. How should we deal with Iran? Should we embrace them with full commerce and send all of our business people over there and try to maximize economic interchange? Or would that just strengthen the regime and entrench the regime more powerfully? I guess my view is I don't have a strong prior view on whether sanctions are good or bad. I'd be open to cases, they may work, they may not work. But certainly with Cuba, we've had them in place since the early 1960s, and there seems to be no consequence, positive, in terms of affecting change there. And it certainly has made the regime somewhat more poor. So President Obama lifted the sanctions. No, he established diplomatic relations and was moving in that way. If you go back and look at the Wall Street Journal a number of years ago, when President Obama did that, there are dueling columns in the Wall Street Journal op-ed page. One by Senator Marco Rubio, who excoriated the president for that decision and said we should clamp down on sanctions and not recognize Cuba. And actually, I wrote the countervailing one, which said that let's give this a shot. We've tried this for 30, 40 years or so. It hasn't worked. Maybe we can, American tourists, college students, go down there for spring break and show them the benefits of commerce and what have you. Maybe that will lead to, and if we lead to the growth of a private sector, that actually the Communist Party could appreciate, maybe they'd make themselves wealthier and want to change and open up. Maybe that's a possibility. It's amazing the criticism that I got for that from many people who said that you'll only enrich the communists, it won't trickle down to the people, and it'll make the regime stronger, and that was not in our interests. So I'm not an expert on Cuban political system or what have you. I don't know who's going to be strengthened or worsened. My idea was that a growing and flourishing private sector acts as a check on the strong state. But maybe it would work out the way the critics would say, so I don't know. So I guess my final answer would be, I'm sort of a utilitarian, if it will. If it's shown that it works, one way or the other, that's what I'd go with. I don't have a principled view for or against sanctions. I think political sciences have studied it, and I think that the general view is that sanctions don't work very well. So I guess I'd accept that in case unless there was other evidence out there.
Hi. So I was curious, with the idea that the global governance institutions like the IMF have been used to kind of enforce that neoliberal policy of trade liberalization in exchange for economic security in the long run, or economic stability in the short term, I suppose. Is there a consequence to this idea that we're putting that neoliberalistic idea, the neoliberalistic value set onto states with the idea in general that it helps them democratize and it helps make security, but now we're seeing that it creates weaker democracies or democracies that are now having a lot of issues with backsliding. Is that an economically secure way to do this, or is the regime failures going to have a backfire effect?
So if you look at that, remember that graph of the sort of wave of reform and starting the mid-'80s into the early 1990s, and all these countries beginning to change. I'm now studying that process and how it unfolded. And I'd spin it a little bit differently than you just suggested. In most cases, it's domestic authorities who decide we've got to change our policies. And then they look to the IMF and the World Bank for either financial assistance or technical assistance in how to pull that off. But it's not as though the World Bank and the IMF are coming in demanding you change. Now, there are cases where the World Bank did say, look, if you want to change your trade policy, we have loans that will help facilitate that process. But countries could always say no, and often they would take the money and then sort of do half-baked reforms. So I view it much more as an indigenous process. So is anyone from India? Okay, so the Indian 1991 reforms are a classic example of this. The Indian authorities had a balance of payments crisis, and they decided we want to change our trade regime. They sought IMF assistance at exactly the same time. So there's this interesting dance where if anything went bad, they could blame the IMF. But it was they who invited and wanted the IMF advice. In fact, they went beyond what the IMF suggested. So the two sort of go hand in hand, but it's not one sort of dominating the other. And I think, actually, I've gone back and looked at various episodes in the past. Korea, South Korea, it's very interesting. When Park Chung-hee, there was a military coup, I think, in 1963. He initially came in, the economy was a basket case. North Korea was actually richer than South Korea. You can look at pictures, just Google South Korea or Seoul, 1960. And sewer in the street, horrible shacks all around. It was in a terrible state. Initially, they didn't change their policy, but eventually Park Chung-hee said, we need to modernize and industrialize because we've got this threat from the north. They're richer than us, and they might want to take us over. And so we asked some economic advisors, what should we do? And the economic advisors, in part, said, the IMF was just here, and they wrote this report that we completely ignored. Maybe we ought to take some of that seriously. And so they implemented that on their own, and it started the miracle that is modern South Korea. They didn't just take, of course, what the IMF said verbatim or what have you. They modified it to tailor their own purposes and their own domestic politics, but it was a basis for stabilizing and improving the economy. So I guess what is often said is neoliberalism as a term of disparagement. I'd say there's a lot of good in neoliberalism. Not in forcing countries to do things that they don't want to do, but if you're talking about market-based economic policies, when you have a lot of distortions in the economy, big fiscal deficits, you need to get your house in order. And that's sometimes what neoliberalism is.
Hi. So I have a fairly wonky question about trade negotiations.
Yep.
So you made a pretty strong case about these 4 good justifications for tariff reduction, but it struck me during the debates for the TPP, particularly on the left, there was a lot of resistance to this notion of investor-state dispute settlement. And so I'm wondering if there's any parallel justification for that, or whether including stuff like that sort of undermines the success of future tariff reductions because of building this political opposition. I mean, is there any parallel 4 points for support of these things like investor-state dispute settlement, or is that just a handout to corporate interests?
So they're sort of, one of the problems with trade negotiations is as tariffs have come down, I sort of showed you how tariffs have come down, these trade agreements involve all sorts of other things. Domestic regulatory regime, patents for pharmaceuticals, investor-state dispute settlement. In some sense, they're a distraction, I think, and they have sort of poisoned the political well because Elizabeth Warren and others can point to them and say, that's why I'm against TPP. She may not like trade liberalization in the first place, but she certainly doesn't like these special carve-outs for special interests, and that's how they're perceived. So I'd be very happy taking them out. I think it would clean things up. At the same time, I think sometimes the case against investor-state dispute settlement is overstated because there haven't been that many cases, and it hasn't really forced countries to do other things. And in fact, sort of the ironic thing is, sometimes we think that the US is forcing other countries to do these things. Mexico and other countries want investor-state dispute settlement in these trade agreements because they want to provide insurance or assurance to foreign investors that they will be treated fairly. If you asked about the Mexican judicial system, and you're a foreign investor thinking about going there, you'd have second doubts. But if Mexico signed this thing, Mexico did so at its own free volition and wanted it in there to say, if you invest here, we won't confiscate your firm. We won't treat you unfairly. You have recourse to something aside from the domestic judicial system, which you may not trust. So that's the ironic thing, is that many developing countries want these things that we here in the United States will say, oh, that's special interest for US multinationals. So that's how it goes. I guess I'd be a little bit more worried about some of the patent protection things which are written in, as opposed to investor state. But I'd be happy if investor state was out too.
Hello.
Oh, sorry.
My name is Jorge Galicia. I'm a Venezuelan political activist rooting for freedom, individual liberty, and private property in my country, of course. And I can totally assure that all that you have said about Venezuela is totally true. So if anyone in this room have any doubt, please don't have it anymore. My question is related about this argument that free trade avoids the possibility of having, wars between countries, because I've heard, and I don't know if it's true, so maybe you have some data about it, that prior World War I, the world was in a huge, was trading a lot among each other. And if this is true, I don't think that it was really helpful. We still have World War I, so I don't know if you have anything to say about that. Thank you.
That's a great episode or era that sort of goes against this more trade promotes or deters war or something. In fact, there's a very famous person, can't remember his first name, Norman Angell, who wrote a book called, I can't remember the title of the book either, but making this case that more trade will prevent war. He had the very unfortunate timing of publishing it right before World War I, when, as you said, there's a pretty high level of degree of integration in Western Europe, and yet we still had this war. So I think his statement would be not that it will prevent all wars, but it makes wars more costly, and therefore that will deter the war. So, how you weigh that, I'm not sure. But there's a literature in political science on whether globalization either contributed to or detracted from the probability that we'd see something like World War I. And I haven't read enough of that to know, but I think that's a really interesting question. It would be a great thesis or paper, I think, for someone to do.
Would you talk a little bit more about what you think would be the ideal U.S. policy towards China? You mentioned cybersecurity, unfair trade laws. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your views about the ideal policy towards China in terms of trade.
Right. So there's an economic component to that. There's a political component to it. I've written many things critical of President Trump's trade policy in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. I've always refrained or qualified that criticism when it comes to China, because I do think we have a problem with China in terms of the way they treat our goods, our firms, maybe not adhering to WTO agreements and the agreements that they've signed. And I think even economists that say at the Cato Institute, which is a free trade think tank in Washington, would say that at the very least we ought to be bringing more cases against China in the WTO and getting allies to force China to address its problems. I think there's a limit to how much you could achieve through the WTO. I think obviously I think that would be a good step to take. And oftentimes in the past, China's lived up to its WTO obligations once a case has been found against them. But I do think that it may not be enough. And I have no problem necessarily with a careful use of threats or even tariffs to try to induce better behavior or to start negotiations with China. So you can have a debate about whether the Trump administration is taking the right approach in terms of the tariffs they've done and the threats they've made. I think my one criticism would be they haven't really identified specifically what sort of agreement they could expect China to sign and live up to get rid of the tariffs or to accomplish the goals that we see, citing chapter and verse. I also worry a little bit about whether the Chinese economic model is just fundamentally incompatible with a market-oriented economy that we sort of implicitly have in our trade agreements and the WTO. In this sense, if you have, I'll use the word massive subsidies for state-owned enterprises and whole chunks of the economy where you do not allow foreign participation, and bailouts, much more larger in scale than we had during the financial crisis. I think basically U.S. trade policy and the GATT and the WTO are predicated on the idea of market forces operating, and that if you have firms that are uneconomic, that they will they will adjust, they will shrink. But if you have a country who says there are certain sectors that we're just not going to allow them to go out of business, that's not the same rules of the game. So when we think about I talked about Cordell Hull and creating this post-World War II international economic order with countries agreeing to reduce tariffs. That was not a world system the same way we've had since 1990 or 2000, because it excluded most of the third world and excluded the communist world. It was an agreement among like-minded countries whose economies were basically very similar in their features. And what we've had since 1995, in particular with the WTO, is developing countries moving in, which I think is fine because many of them moved in a market-oriented direction. But we've also had communist countries such as China, where they used to be moving towards the use of more markets, but under President Xi, just in the last 3 to 5 years, has moved back towards much more heavy-handed state and authoritarian approach to economic life. So regardless of what I personally think, I think this president and the next president are going to have big problems with China. And former Secretary of Treasury Hank Paulson has spoken about an economic iron curtain descending in between the US and China. And he's worried about that. He was always in favor of engagement, thinking engagement can help change China in ways that we think would be good. I think he would back off from that and say it hasn't actually worked out that way. And even if you have just 10% tariffs, as we do on many Chinese goods, with the threat that they might go up, that is enough of a disincentive for many US multinationals who source from China to shift towards other Southeast Asian countries. So this is an issue that I think will be a major one for the US, not just now, but for the next 5 and 10 years. And when you layer on top of it that there's sort of this great power competition and strategic issues between the two countries and national security threats, that means it's going to be very difficult to unravel this whole thing. Huawei is a great example of that. You know, what if you're flying an F-15 jet and there's a chip in your cockpit that has been programmed in China? That's what the Defense Department is worried about. Or intercepting communications and backdoor channels. You know, what if Russia can shut down our grid, or China can, because the semiconductors come from China and have been compromised? That's a big issue, and that's where defense comes in. We talked about defense. You know, there may be still economic gains from engaging with China, but if it's a national security threat, if they can shut down our lights for months on end, that's a problem. So once again, I'm not necessarily accusing China of having done all those things, but I think there's enough worry in the national security establishment in the US to make me pause before just saying, oh yes, we should have free and unfettered commerce between the US and China.
Thank you, Doug. Please join me in thanking Doug for our wonderful conversation this evening. Thank you.
Thank you all.